his comments when he arrived in LA of like, oh, I am the system, et cetera, et cetera. Harden's true shooting percentage, 63%. He's also taking 58% of his shots from downtown, which is a career high in terms of the percentage of shots he's taking from downtown. Only 6.9 per 36, though, which is
that's a great indication of how much smaller his role is. That 7 per 36 is more than half of his shots.
Yeah, it is, and that is way below where he was, where he's in double digits per 36 in Houston. But he's shooting 40.5% from three. That would be a career high, and that 3-point attempts per 36, about 7, is about where he's been since leaving Houston, both in Brooklyn and in Philly, and now in LA. So the big difference from where it's been before is the decline in his number of 2-point attempts. He's taking 5 2-point attempts per 36, making right about 50% of those. And his assists per 36 down about 1.5 a game from Philadelphia. And the usage is just over 20%. That's actually been rising of late with Paul George playing less and struggling with this groin issue. So he's moving into a little bit more of a secondary creator role now than he has in the past. If you look at how he's generated offense this year as opposed to last year, anything jump out to you, Danny?
Couple things. As a proportion of his possessions, meaningfully less isolation, about 6% less ISO, about 5% more spot ups. So that is typically a mark in a shift and roll. And another thing for Harden is he's taking more of his shots in transition. That is another mark of a decrease in roll because you don't generally get that many more transition opportunities. It's just they make up a larger part of the sample if you're taking fewer shots elsewhere.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And pick and roll ball handler, Harden kind of moved from being the pick and roll maestro early in his Houston tenure into being more of an isolation guy. That has dissipated some. He hasn't gone to that step back, and that step back hasn't been as effective this year. Instead, he's shooting the three a lot out of high pick and roll. He's got a 65% true shooting when he shoots out of pick and roll. And he's taking a lot of these dribble jumpers out of pick and roll. He's making 51% on jumpers off the dribble. And a fair number of those are threes. I'd say most of them are 69% field goal percentage. And as I watched those plays, he's really improved at just taking that normal non-ISO 3 off the dribble. The scouting report on him seems to be to go under because you don't want to let him get into the lane because he's such a good passer, setting up a roll man like Zubats. And he just has become less of a caricature of himself, which he became towards the end of his Houston days. And then even when he first arrived in Philly, I think he deserves a lot of credit for breaking out of that mold, despite his comments when he arrived in LA of like, oh, I am the system, et cetera, et cetera. But he actually has opened up more options for himself because he's just willing to take different types of shots. He can shoot threes off the dribble going left, which he really never did. He can shoot threes off the dribble going right. He doesn't have to kind of just rhythmically take the step back to get his three off anymore. And he's such a good shooter that there's no reason for him out of a regular pick and roll, if he could just get comfortable with it again, that he has to step back. Like, that does make the shot harder objectively. Mm-hmm. And so he can shoot the J going left now from mid-range as well, from the left elbow out of pick and roll. He can obviously get to a spot, use his body to create a little space. That started in Philly where he was shooting more mid-rangers out of pick and roll or isolation. So the scouting report does still seem to mostly go under. You might say we want to try to get him shooting inside the arc, but then that opens up his passing game a little bit more to the big. And then where he also has been much more effective is on layups. He's shooting a career high 75% at the rim. Doesn't get there that often. And of course, he still gets fouled a reasonable amount, although nowhere near as much as he did in his heyday. So going to the basket out of pick and roll, that includes floaters as well. 58% true shooting. Last year, that was 50% going to the basket out of pick and roll. That's interesting because you would think Joel would have had the defense sticking close to him, and it would have been harder for Harden to finish. Instead, he's found it going a little bit easier to finish at the rim out of pick and roll. And he's shooting poorly from floater range. That was a shot he really worked on towards the end of his Houston tenure, beginning of his time with the Nets. I thought it turned into a real weapon in the 21 season for him when he was in the MVP conversation before he got the first of those hamstring injuries. So if that is able to come back, I don't think he's going to continue shooting this crazy well on threes off the dribble out of pick and roll. But that was a shot that he really hadn't been taking probably the last 5 years or so, to just, the defense went under. Right, I'm just going to fire it right away instead of having to take a bunch of weird dribbles. He's doing a much better job to me of taking what the defense gives him. When you look at the way he drives in isolation, he goes about 50% of the time left, 50% of the time right. And so he's just been very in control, accessing different parts of his game and attacking more judiciously. And unlike someone like Bradley Beal, that lower role has enabled him to be more efficient.
Yeah, it's the Clippers are one of the bigger stories that we're not talking about as much. I mean, the projection
they just had the best 30-game stretch in team history, 25-5.
Incredible.